Stories about America to read aloud. Number 6, Tad Lincoln's Goats. 4 ladies were sitting in the beautiful East Room of the White House, which is the home of the President of the United States. They had come all the way from Boston to visit this famous house. Now they were admiring the velvet carpets and the fine furniture. Suddenly there was a great clattering noise outside the door. Then the door banged open, and slammity slam, rackety rack, a team of goats came dashing into the East Room. They were hitched to a kitchen chair, and driving them was a little boy who waved a long whip as he shouted to the goats, "Giddy up! Giddy up! Gidap! Gidap!" The boy was surprised to see the ladies, and the ladies looked quite surprised at seeing goats in the White House. But it didn't bother the boy that there were visitors. "Look out there!" he yelled at the ladies. Then, "Gidap, Nanny! Gidap, Nanko!" he commanded. Down the room raced the team of goats. It was a big room, 80 feet long and 40 feet wide. The goats had space for a good run, past the great fireplaces, past the long mirrors. Overhead, the crystal chandeliers shook from all the commotion. At the far end of the room, the boy turned his team in the swooping circle and drove it back. "Get out of the way there!" he shouted to the ladies. And through the door the goats and the boy ran, clippity-clop, lickety-lop. "Well!" gasped the ladies. "Well!" It was all they could think of to say. The boy was Tad Lincoln. He was 10 years old, and his father was President Abraham Lincoln. Tad wasn't his real name. His real name was Thomas, but he was such a wriggler that his father started calling him Tadpole, and soon he was Tad to everybody. A tadpole is a baby frog. He was a good, kind-hearted little fellow, but he was full of fun and pranks, too. Once he ate up all the strawberries the cook was preparing for a big state dinner. Once he bombarded a cabinet meeting of serious, bearded gentlemen with his toy cannon. And people said he always made so much noise that it was more like 6 boys instead of only one little Tad. Tad's goats were named Nanny and Nanko. He loved them dearly. He loved all his pets, and he had many. He had a dog and a cat and lots of rabbits. He had a pony to ride. He almost had some elephants. The king of Siam, which is now Thailand, had wanted to give his father some elephants, but the president said no. He already had a very large elephant on hand that took all his attention, and even the nation didn't know what to do with it. That was supposed to be a joke, Tad knew, but he didn't think it was very funny. He would rather have had the king's elephants. Of all his pets, Tad had most fun with Nanny and Nanko. Sometimes he tied ropes to their collars and led them around like pet dogs. Sometimes he would start a play fight. He would butt the goats with his head, and the goats would butt him back. Best fun of all, though, was to take the goats for a frolic on the broad grassy lawn of the White House. How the boy and the goats would run and play. The president, standing at the White House window, would watch the trio and smile. President Lincoln had many grave problems to take care of, for the country was at war. It relaxed his mind to watch his little son frisking with Nanny and Nanko. It pleased him to see Tad happy with his goats. It pleased Tad's mother, Mrs. Lincoln, too, but it didn't please the White House gardener. He didn't like goats. He was the man who kept the grassy lawns looking so nice, and who planted and weeded and watered the flowers, and trimmed the hedges and pruned the trees. He wasn't a bit pleased to see a pair of goats making wreckage of all his hard work. And make wreckage they did, especially Nanny. Nanny was always slipping out of her stall at the White House stable and hurrying to the lawns to leap among the flowers and chew on the bushes and make a nuisance of herself generally. Nanny, in the iris bed, was happier than a rabbit in a carrot patch. She was happier than a mouse in a cheese box or a bear in a honey tree. Nanny, jumping this way and hopping that way through the iris, was the happiest little old goat you could ever want to see. And that made Tad happy. It made Mrs. Lincoln happy. It made the president happy. But it didn't make the gardener happy. Still, what could he do except complain? And when he complained, who would listen? Nanko wasn't like Nanny. Nanko behaved himself rather well for a goat. She stayed quietly in the stable where she belonged. If the gardener had liked goats, any goats, he would have liked Nanko, but he didn't. One summer day, Tad and his mother went on a little trip to the beautiful mountains of Vermont. The president had to stay at home, for he was very busy. Nanny and Nanko stayed at home, too. Nanko kept to the stable like a good goat, but Nanny slipped out when nobody was looking and went running through the flower beds again. Ugh! But the gardener was furious. He had stood just about all he was going to stand from Nanny Goat. So the president had Nanny brought into the White House where she would not be able to bother the gardener's flowers. Nanny began hunting for Tad. She was terribly lonesome, and she just could not believe he had gone away and left her. When she could not find him, she went into his room and jumped up on his bed. After a while, Mrs. Cuthbert, the housekeeper, found her there, lying in the middle of Tad's bed, chewing her little cud. Mrs. Cuthbert chased her away. Nanny didn't know what to do with herself. She was getting more lonesome all the time. For 2 days she wandered sadly around the big empty White House. Then finally she spied an outside door someone had left partly open. Out the door she went in a rush. It wasn't that she really wanted to play outside by herself, but even a goat has to do something to occupy her time. So Nanny went bucking and batting and butting over the lawn, digging her sharp little hoofs into freshly spaded flower beds, stopping now and then to nibble a pretty bloom. A few days later, the president wrote Mrs. Lincoln a sad letter. He said for her to tell Tad that his nanny goat was lost, and that Daddy, and Mrs. Cuthbert were very sorry. The president said the gardener kept complaining that she destroyed the flowers, till it was concluded to bring her down to the White House. This was done, and the second day she disappeared and has not been heard of since. This is the last we know of poor Nanny. When Tad came home, Nanko was safely in the stable, but Nanny was gone. What happened to Nanny? Tad never found out. Mrs. Lincoln never found out. The president never found out. But to this day, some people think that the gardener, who didn't like goats in the first place, and especially didn't like Nanny, and particularly didn't like Nanny getting into the flowers, well, some people think that the gardener may have known more about how Nanny disappeared than he ever let on. What do you think?